And so this is all about the fact that we are increasingly needing to use and have awareness of security technologies because of the devices and services that we're using. But quite often, it seems to me at least, this knowledge, this ability to secure ourselves seems to be assumed by those providing the devices and services to us. And perhaps we need a bit more support than we're actually getting. So let's explore this as we go through. So yeah, as I've already mentioned, essentially, our digital behavior, the way that we interact with technology, often perhaps overlooks cybersecurity. We, as users, we readily take on the new technologies very often. We see the benefits that they can offer, and the risks perhaps track along later. We realize what the potential problems are further down the line. Instinctively, we know that many of these technologies are not risk-free, but again, we prefer to think about what could it give us. And so this is perhaps something that people push to the back of their minds in their enthusiasm to take advantage of the technology opportunities. And I suppose what's also maybe curious is that we sometimes, although we've learned perhaps some of the lessons on some technologies already, we don't seem to necessarily carry that awareness and that secure behavior that we might have established in one place forward into the next form of technology or service that we start to use. We seem to have to relearn a lot of the basic lessons. So let's think about what we need to protect, just as a sort of bit of basic scene setting. So I guess we've got what are now a standard array of devices. So desktop PCs, laptops, and increasingly our smart devices, our smartphones and tablets. But also, increasingly as we move forward, these are being joined by a whole range of other technologies, things that actually have existed in one form or another in the past, but we've not needed to think about them as smart devices, connected devices, where you need to think about securing them. So if I could see a show of hands in a room, I would ask how many people have done a virus scan on their smart TV? And yeah, it's not the sort of thing that we had to think about maybe 5 years ago. But now, if you look at the menu options on your smart devices, your TV, you might find that you've got malware scanning capability there, an added bonus for the new technology age for us. Okay, so we've got a wider range of things we need to protect. So what do we like with our cybersecurity? Historically, we quite often don't seem to be very good at it. There are many areas where we as users are established as I've said on the slide, failing, but certainly not being up to the level where we could be relied upon to be protecting ourselves. So there's a history of people choosing weak passwords, and this is a theme that we'll come back to shortly. We're rather variable in our extent of applying patches. So you get security updates to protect our devices to make sure that the latest vulnerabilities are safeguarded against. But if we don't apply the update, we don't apply the patch, then the device remains vulnerable and actually at more risk, because now attackers and malicious code know about it and can exploit it more readily. We know we should do backups of our important data. Much of what we have is important. Do we back it up? Well, again, it varies. People seem to assume that somebody else might be doing it for them, or that the device will never fail. So why should they need to back up? Potentially oversharing our personal data. Social media has made us very good at doing this. But equally, it can happen in other contexts as well. We potentially fall victim to social engineering scams. So I guess phishing is the most common incarnation in which we might face this. And even though it's been a threat that's been around for 3 decades or more now, we still find ourselves susceptible to being infected by malware, even on desktop and laptop type systems where that threat really has been there all along. And increasingly, though, we've also been exposed on other platforms, such as smartphones, for example, where it wasn't originally there, but now it is, and we've not been prepared for it. And so all of these areas are aspects in which we can fall foul of the threats that are out there. So in terms of this thing, cybersecurity literacy, as I've termed it, what do we need to know and what do we need to be able to do as a consequence? And my extremely exotic graphic here is trying to depict some of the baseline things that I feel that any user of technology ought to have some awareness of, and also some capability to do something about. And so if we go sort of clockwise around these icons, we're talking about having protection against malware. We're talking about being able to deal with authentication in whatever form it takes. We're talking about doing backups of our data, applying patches, dealing with networks and connectivity in a secure way. So, for example, being aware that not every Wi-Fi network you come across is a safe environment. Protecting our devices. I've got a picture of a smartphone there, but that's meant to signify more the general application of these principles across devices. The capability to operate safely online, handling our data, and also linked to that privacy. So that's the basic set of behaviors and knowledge that I'm saying that people probably ought to have. Now, within the presentation, I'm going to home in on just one of them, really, which is around authentication, and even more particularly around passwords. Now, this in no way is a future technology. In fact, it's a technology that we're seeking to move away from, but it's a very good example of where cybersecurity literacy can be seen to be letting us down somewhat at the moment. And although passwords are an old technology, they're going to be around some way into the future yet. So it's still a lesson that's useful to learn. But thinking about, well, okay, we've got that set of things that people ought to know about then. So where could we get potentially guidance from? And so I've got a couple of screenshots here of websites that are advisory sources. So from the US, we've got the Stay Safe online site there from the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and then a UK example, the Get Safe Online website. And both of these have a whole set of guidance that's end user facing and also in some cases relevant to small organizations, where it will tell you about the sort of thing you need to know about, and it will give pointers towards how to deal with it. But again, fundamentally, people even need to know that that's there and think to make reference to it in order to get perhaps some of this good practice guidance. So, okay, I promised you just a couple of slides ago we'd talk about passwords. I'm sure that thrilled you. So let's explore this a little bit more. So we've been told for many years that passwords are dead. If you do a web search for the phrase passwords are dead, you will find many articles announcing the death of passwords or predicting that within a year or so, or a couple of years, they will be gone. But they're not. And they're still with us in many shapes and sizes, across many devices, across many services, and they keep recurring as a cause of cybersecurity breach. So I've got the Verizon data breach report as evidence there. 80% of the hacking-related breaches that had led to data compromise in that report had either leveraged stolen or weak passwords in that process. Now, okay, stolen passwords implies a weakness on the system that was compromised. Weak passwords, that's a failing of the people, or the people that chose the passwords, that set the passwords on the account. Now, before I go much further, I should say I'm ultimately not going to be blaming the users entirely for this. It's all very well saying that people made weak choices, but there could be an underlying reason why their choices were not the best that they could have been. So, okay, what this leads to, given that passwords are still very much in use and very much a cause of breaches, we do need to still give some attention to people's choice of passwords and also how they manage them, which are fundamental bits of cybersecurity literacy and good practice in general. So I'll give you a moment to consider this slide, which is Splash Data's annual or extract from Splash Data's annual top 100 list of what they term the worst passwords that are out there. And these are passwords that have been involved in compromised sites, data breaches, etc. And these were the passwords where what user accounts were found to be using in these trolled sets of passwords. And what we can see, if we look at the most recent set, which is the results from 2019, you can see top of the list, and it has been for the last few years anyway, is the incredibly imaginative password of 123456. And why is that a popular password? Well, many websites, for example, and many other services insist upon a 6-character minimum length of passwords. So what 6 characters come to mind most readily for people? Well, 123456 is quite memorable. You're not going to forget that. And so if the system lets you get away with using it, many people seem to do so. Dropping down a few in this year's or the most recent ranking is the word password, which previously had ranked at number 2 quite consistently. Again, a word that users find quite easy to remember. If they've got a prompt saying password, typing password in response to it is quite an easy association to make. But of course, none of these choices that we see here are good ones. Hence, they're in the list of worst passwords. So how do people keep doing this? Year on year, we've got the same passwords recurring or similarly poor choices entering the list. Well, if we look at the way that the results here tend to get reported year on year, and here we got some quotes that are extracts from some news stories accompanying the most recent or the most recent after that instances of this survey getting reported. So sort of things commentators say, people are doing exactly what they're not supposed to do. The only criteria was to fill was, can my fingers reach it without my brain getting involved? And basically, some people never learn. So it's all of this seems to be the fault of the users. It's their fault. Let's blame them. It's nothing to do with anybody else, would seem to be the message coming through. But is that really fair? And you can probably tell from my sort of presentation of this so far, I don't think it is fair, because actually we need to have supported the users to not be making this sort of mistake. So let's look at an example of a site that you may be familiar with. I've heard that this one is fairly popular, and here is a sign-up page for this particular social media site. And what we can see here is the opportunity for somebody to create an account. And okay, they're being asked for various bits of information. What you don't see on this screen is any guidance about how to choose a password. And nonetheless, in that sort of fourth field down, so to speak, that's exactly what somebody's being asked to do. They're being asked to select a password to create their account. How are they supposed to know what a good password is? Well, let's assume they know already, because surely they use password-based systems elsewhere, or they were born with the knowledge of what a good password is, so they'll manage. So at this point, no guidance. So the user here, Fred Smith, has chosen an incredibly imaginative 4-character password. So let's see where we go with that. Oh, so actually, no, Fred can't choose the 4-character password. Now, having tried to do so, they are receiving, well, whether we call it guidance or feedback, they're now being told something about what the site is actually looking for. The password needs to be at least 6 characters long, and they need to try another. Are there any other criteria? Well, we don't know, because it's not telling us. And so Fred can carry on experimenting until he comes to a password that's actually acceptable. If we look at another site, similar situation, really. A lot of white space around here where they could conceivably have put a link to say, here's some guidance on how you might choose a password. Here's what our password rules might be. Something other than just an empty box and do you feel lucky? But nonetheless, nothing provided there either. So if we look at both of those sites and then see the sort of things that users will get in response to putting poor choices, you see that they do get a sort of progressive reveal of some rules. So in the case of Facebook there, okay, went for 6 characters after being told the initial one was too short, and went for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say. And in response to that, they then get told to choose a more secure password. Interestingly, now it should be longer than 6 characters, not at least 6 characters. So even the advice there is contradicting itself. And it should be difficult for others to guess. Well, but what does that mean? Given that you've just had a user who's put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in as their password choice, perhaps they might need some guidance on what difficult for others to guess might actually mean. Meanwhile, with Twitter, what we can see here is sort of different variations of the feedback once you get going. So apparently a 1-character password, it's not going to work. Once you try a 1-character password, it tells you at that point needs to be at least 6. So, okay, let's go for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, need to choose a stronger password then. Okay, so 7 ones then. That's an imaginative choice. And apparently that's quite acceptable. It's not rated strong on the password meter, but it gets a tick. So that site's going to accept that password as being acceptable. And I put my thinking cap on a little bit more, really put some effort into thinking about a strong password. And I know from things I've heard in the past, you ought to use an uppercase character, lowercase character, numbers, and a punctuation symbol. So I came up with password1 exclamation mark. And amazingly, that's almost a maximum score on the password meter. So it's not necessarily giving me particularly accurate feedback to learn from either, because, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe password1 exclamation mark is a good choice after all. So actually, over the years, I've been looking at this theme of password guidance and enforcement of rules across popular public-facing websites. And I've actually, having had a good idea once, I've not let it go. And I've now done the same study on 4 different occasions from 2007 till 2018 was the most recent time I did it. So maybe next year I'll do another one. Basically, in each of these occasions, what I've looked at is the extent to which 10 of the leading websites at the time provide password guidance to users, and also the extent to which they enforce good practice in the way that I've just shown those other 2 sites doing so. So do they make sure you use a minimum length? Do they enforce character composition or not, etc.? So what's interesting for the purposes of this talk, where we're talking about the extent to which cybersecurity literacy is promoted, is perhaps the degree to which leading websites at the last point when I did this study were providing guidance to users to help them understand what a good password actually is and how to deal with it. So here were the sites in the most recent version of the study. And you can see there that only one of them, Google, actually provides any guidance upfront, list of guidance or a link to guidance at the point when the user is faced with that empty password box to create their account. So I'm not talking about that progressive reveal of rules as feedback in response to making the wrong choices. I'm talking about a clear statement up front about what you're working to. Similarly, only Google provided guidance when the user elects to change their password, and actually different sites provided guidance at the point where the user's forgotten their password and has asked to be able to do a reset. So overall, the picture there is not particularly encouraging. Most sites don't tell the users anything up front. They might still enforce guidance, they might still give point-by-point feedback, but there's nothing there to refer to at the outset. So as I mentioned already, perhaps the website providers assume we already know this. We knew this already, we should know this from elsewhere. I would say it's still not really an excuse not to provide some support, but it also raises the question, okay, if I'm supposed to know it from somewhere else, where am I supposed to know it from? And so let's look at some of those other sources that people might be using, and particularly if they were to use the national or sort of nationally prominent cybersecurity end user guidance in their own territory. So what I've done here is looked at a set of things to look for within the password related guidance on these national advisory sites. So things like Stay Safe Online and Get Safe Online that I gave you the screenshots from before. And what I've looked at is what do they say in relation to things related to the selection or creation of the user's password, and also guidance around the user's subsequent management of them. And so basically it should be flagged here that they might say something about a certain criteria, but they might not necessarily say a good thing about it. So you could have, for example, presence of some guidance relating to whether or about the theme of password change, but what you say about it might be a good or a bad thing. So for example, the current standard advice around changing passwords is not to do it, not to force users to regularly change passwords. The standard advice at the moment is get them to choose a good password in the first place and then be able to stick with it. Equally, you can have advice on storing passwords, but if that advice is not to do it at all, then that's perhaps not helpful advice. Perhaps better password storage advice is to use a credible password management tool in order to store it. So let's have a look at that a little bit through, and then we'll look into more detail. So in terms of password selection related criteria, the sort of things I was looking at were, does the guidance being provided give any guidance about what good or bad choices might look like? Does it mention anything about password composition? And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that they should say you need to choose a password with numbers, letters, uppercase, or uppercase, lowercase, and symbol characters, because actually the current advice these days is not to force different character combinations. Password.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry, my Siri is activating in the background, so I do apologize for that noise there. Don't know what I said then. I don't think it sounded like the trigger words, but anyway. Equally, password length, is anything said about that? Does the guidance give any suggestions on techniques for selecting good passwords? Does it flag two-factor authentication as being something that the user might want to enable? And does it talk about the need for uniqueness of passwords across different devices or accounts that you're trying to protect? So all of these things are relevant when the user is choosing their password in the first instance. There are also some things that could usefully be said to guide the user about then managing their password on existing accounts or across accounts. So for example, whether there's anything said about the need to change the password. And of course, as I mentioned, it could be to advise them to do it or not to do it, and one or other of those is good. About reusing passwords that they've already used on the site before, guarding against sharing them with other people, advice on how to store them, and talking about tools to help support the management of passwords. So all of these sort of things are relevant points that password guidance could cover. So the earlier studies that I did, they looked at what popular website services had to say about it. But in this particular case, I'm now looking at national security advisory sites like GetSafe Online and StaySafe Online, which say citizens in those countries might naturally be directed towards as the official guidance for their country, if nothing else. So looked at a series of these, so 8 of them across English-speaking countries, or countries where they had English-speaking guidance available. One of the constraints being that's the language I use, so I could assess in that language. So we've got these 8 countries and these 8 advisory sources linked to them. So they're the main advice sources for the countries concerned. And just to give it in another sort of ticks and crosses colourful table here, what we can see in this chart is basically the end result. Which of these countries and their associated sources said something about each of these relevant, what I would argue are relevant criteria to mention. And we can see, okay, that everybody had something to say about password length. Not everybody had something to say about sharing passwords and guiding in that context. The UK site had something to say about everything, but doesn't necessarily mean it was a good thing to say. So even to see whether the topics were covered, this is what this is showing. It's not saying whether it was good or bad guidance. It's just saying whether the characteristic was mentioned. So let's have a look then a little bit deeper and see this point about it's not only they need to say something about it, they need to say something credible. So I say a tick in the box there, just to go back to show you those ticks in the boxes, doesn't mean that the advice was consistent or credible advice between the different sources. So all of them, for example, had something to say, as we saw, about password length, but what they said was extremely variable. So for example, Canada suggests a minimum password length of 8 characters, whereas the United States source suggested a minimum length of 12. Some of them suggested maximum lengths of password. So again, is there a right answer amongst all of this? Well, my instinct would be to say the minimum of 12 is a good start and don't suggest a maximum, because that really ought to depend on what the user is comfortable remembering or managing. But the point here is inconsistency. If we think about some positives coming out of it, well, looking at the techniques criterion, commonly suggested approach was to use passphrases. So for example, getting a set of random words and joining them together to create a single long password is a bit of sort of nationally recommended guidance from, for example, NIST and from the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK. So it's a good point to mention. Many sites had something to say about two-factor authentication. And so that helps to support the user if they've got something to supplement the basic secret-based part of passwords. And some sites were also quite usefully giving some guidance on how to do the good practice on different devices and different operating systems. However, if we were to look at maybe the less positive things, and again, we're trying to support good cybersecurity literacy here, various of the sites were suggesting, oh, you should use a combination of numbers, letters, or uppercase and lowercase, and punctuation characters. But of course, this contradicts the advice that's now been out for about 3 years, or more, in fact, from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and others, which actually say the complexity of the password is not as important as its length. And going for the length makes it easier to remember for the user without them writing it down, etc. The Canadian site I thought was interesting, which basically says try a mix of your pet's name, your favorite numbers, and the street you grew up on. All of which are the sort of things you would tell people not to use as the basis for their password, because they are things that people could know about them or social engineer from them. And actually using them in combination doesn't make it any more difficult to get the individual elements of this information. New Zealand site advised against storing the password in your browser because hackers go after that. Well, okay, but actually some browsers will store the password in a secure place like your keychain and will not necessarily expose it in the same way. So if people take this guidance at face value, they're going to be denying themselves some of the usability conveniences that would otherwise be there. So just before we draw to a sort of a close, let's have a look at some specific guidance from, in this case, the Canadian site. So here I've got a screenshot of their password guidance bit, and I'll highlight a few things. So I'd already mentioned this one about a mix of your pet's name, etc. So let's see further down in their list, some other interesting ones. So commit your passwords to memory. Don't store them on your computer or in your mobile phone. So don't use a password manager, then don't use any tool that might help you to do it. Put them all in your memory, and that is more likely to make you as an individual use the same password for multiple sites because you can't remember 100 different passwords in your mind without storing them somewhere safely. If your browser asks you to keep signing in, unclick that option, which again makes it somewhat more difficult for you, perhaps. If you get an email that includes the password you've just set up, then delete it. If you get an email that includes your password at all, regardless of whether you've just set it up, I would say delete it. Maybe consider changing the password. And change your password after implementing a fix or following being compromised. Okay, after following being compromised, that would seem to make sense, although that's not clear necessarily what being compromised might mean. And change your password after implementing a fix. Well, I would imagine many users will read that as being after you've installed an update of some description or after you've installed a critical security patch for your operating system. Does that mean you should change your password every time you install one of those? It shouldn't, but that's what some people might read it as, which will make using their passwords even more problematic. Of course, even if you follow all of this, you can still encounter problems in practice. So here we have an example of one of the browser-related conveniences or the system conveniences of auto-suggesting a strong password for you. And then this particular website won't let you use the auto-suggested password because the password suggested is longer than the website in question will accept. Not helpful, but that's the website's fault. And in this particular case, so we've got a decent password here, but it's not satisfying the criteria of using upper and lowercase letters and at least one number, which the current good practice guidance would suggest you shouldn't be forcing people to do, but this particular site demands that you do that. And so, again, the user is forced to do something that other guidance might not actually be suggesting that they should. So again, a site implementation issue, not a guidance issue. So, all right, drawing us to a close, one of the foundations for getting cybersecurity addressed properly amongst users ought to be to give them some proper advice, clear advice on how they should do the things that are expected of them. So I say, in terms of this assessment of the password guidance sites or the advisory sources, it's not necessarily what each individual one did or didn't say, but rather the level of inconsistency across the set of them as a whole, particularly where they're not being compliant with the current good practice guidance that security services, etc., have been suggesting for a number of years now, or standards bodies. Given that passwords have had such a bad press over such a long time and they're regularly criticized as being such a poor technique, you'd at least think we might now have some consistency in how to use them well, but quite clearly we don't. And if we can't get it right here with something that we've been using for so long, does this really bode well for other aspects of cybersecurity that users need to be equally aware of and equally responsible for as individuals? So final point then, or final point, as we move forward, inevitably, this is going to become more important, not less. Cybersecurity literacy will be required as an underpinning for more and more things that we use, even more than we do now. So we need to ensure that the messages to people are clear, and we need to have effective ways for them to receive those messages. And it's not just, as it says at the bottom there, the responsibility of the device providers or the website service providers, etc., but they've certainly got a part to play. But we need that message to be available to people and reaching them via as many avenues as possible and in as consistent a possible way so they get it clearly. So a couple of references. So talking about the different dimensions of what people ought to know more holistically is a paper that I wrote back in 2014 on that theme, and the specifics of the cybersecurity, the password guidance study that I mentioned and had the tables from. That was published earlier this year at the annual security conference in Las Vegas. And if you're interested in either of those, just feel free to pop me an email and I'll happily point you in the direction. And if you want the email address, there it is. And if you're a Twitter user and you want to follow my ramblings there, feel free to do that as well. And other than that, thank you very much.